Many of the folks who are farming this land are thinking in their head, I'm going to pass this down to my children, my grandchildren. So this is going to stay in the family for hundreds of years. And so if you approach someone with that mindset and say, I want to buy this, the answer is no.
This is Built, a new podcast series where you'll meet the people behind some of the biggest transactions and investments in commercial real estate and hear how they got to where they are today. I'm your host, Brian Mon, Chief Marketing Officer with Fidelity National Financial. And we wanted to bring you this show because those of us in the business know the buildings. But how many of us know the stories of the people behind those structures? That's what we're going to bring you every 2 weeks during this first season. My first guest is Tyrone Thomas. Tyrone is Deputy General Counsel with Invenergy, a leader in large-scale energy generation and storage facilities. You know, wind farms, solar farms, battery storage. It's real estate, but not as most of us know it. And Tyrone, based in Chicago, is joining us today to give us a look into his built world. I wanted to just start by talking with you a little bit about how you got interested in law in the first place. What was it that kind of drove you or compelled you to become an attorney?
So in my circumstance, there was no push. There was no one in the family who was an attorney asking me to be an attorney. But I stumbled upon a program when I was in high school, and I grew up in West Philadelphia. And when I was in high school, there was a slew of programs called Explorer programs geared at certain careers, medical explorers, police explorers. And I can't remember how, but I stumbled upon a legal explorers program, applied and was accepted. And what the program consisted of, per my memory, my junior year of high school, myself and let's say 10 other students, the same vintage, every Thursday, I think we would go downtown, and there's a strip in downtown Philadelphia where all of the law firms and the banks are for the most part. And we would go to this one law firm, and they would take us into a large conference room, and we would have these sessions once a week. And so each student was assigned an associate who was effectively a mentor. But then the firm, the managing partner, various other practice group leaders would put on presentations for the students, and they would talk about the practice of law in various different disciplines. They would train us, and we would put on moot court competitions against each other. We got to sit in on a murder trial. At least for myself, I was entranced. And at that point, I was 16. I said, I want to be an attorney.
That's a great story. How did you make the transition or make the decision to specialize and work in commercial real estate?
It was my discovery that other people were making the decision for me that really kind of led me in this direction. I wound up doing an urban studies degree at Hunter College in New York City. And, really interesting. Obviously, there's some land use elements to it, but there are also some variety of political elements to it. And so flash forward to law school, when I'm interviewing with law firms, my first and my second summer, I keep being set up with real estate attorneys for the interviews. And at some point, I was noticing a pattern. I'm talking to my wife. I met in law school, the first day of law school. So I'm talking to my wife, girlfriend at the time. And we realized that it's because I have this urban studies degree on my resume that people think that I'm interested in real estate and land use. And I hadn't made a decision as to what direction I wanted to go, but I realized that there was a door being opened for me that I was not against walking through.
As you kind of look back, was there anything that kind of, the pattern makes sense, my interest in urban studies, maybe where I grew up, was there anything that kind of you can see that led you to this interest that maybe you didn't know at the time was kind of a passion for you?
I think so. I grew up, like I said, in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia historically had been Euclidean zoned. And so you have these residential neighborhoods, and then you have the commercial neighborhoods, and there's bleed over now with later development, but it's still pretty strong. The neighborhood I grew up in, aside from corner stores or bodegas, as they're called in New York, there's no real commercial shopping outside of specific strips. And so, there's a comfort to it. I think here in Chicagoland, where I am, it's what you see in the suburbs, right? It's only the neighborhood. Everyone's car looks like, no one else drives through. And I think that there was a benefit to that, but I think that also you could see in the way that the city was laid out that it also lent itself to a certain type of economic and sometimes racial segregation throughout the city's corridors. And so going into urban studies, one of the things you got to look at is some of that urban planning. There were also cultural considerations of the time. If you were designing a city in the early part of the 20th century, you were racially segregating that city because you had people that didn't want to live with other people. And understanding that, being a part of how you turn some of those things back, I think that was always of interest to me. And so, going into law school, we got to do pro bono work in the landlord tenant clinic and work with, low income tenants primarily, though some low income landlords in certain circumstances as well. And yeah, it always was interesting. And there was always that human element to it that I think really hit home for me. And it was something that I saw personally growing up.
That human element kept playing out in his work. Tyrone graduated from law school and got a job with a large law firm. During the next several years, he lived in 3 different cities, got to know all kinds of different real estate, government buildings, restaurants, hospitals, nursing homes, to name a few. And with each transaction, he came to better understand the buildings and the people they served.
And so when the Invenergy opportunity came up, obviously the work they're doing and the impact that it's having on the world is a draw, right? But it's also a draw to do it differently. Now, this is utility scale, but this is not just industrial real estate. This is something different. They had one person for 6 years. He had left and they hired another person. So they needed 2 of us. They basically said, let's have 2 people do this job for some time. Now there's, surprise, I've got 9 people on my team, lawyers dedicated just to this job and what will be 6 paralegals. But, we got to come in and just work. Got to come in and learn all of the weird things and put process in place. That to me was interesting because the work, I geek out over the work itself and I geek out over the problems we run into in the field. And you don't run into more wacky problems than when you're dealing with land that has never had a large scale commercial loan on it before.
So let's talk a little bit about the work. Describe for us what Invenergy does and what their goal or what the focus has been and is, and then lead that into kind of the work you do.
Sure. Invenergy is a global leader in sustainable energy solutions, and that is appropriately broad. We develop, build, own, and operate utility scale energy generation and storage facilities and certain other utility scale sustainability solutions. But I would say the bread and butter is the generation facilities and to some degree the storage. So you've seen there's about 150 facilities, a little more than that Invenergy has successfully developed around the world. Many of those are wind farms, utility scale wind farms, utility scale solar farms, or utility scale battery storage, often co-located battery storage, co-located with wind or solar. And to do that work, it's years in the making from idea inception to the point where we're building the project. But in that process, you can look at it as an engineering shop from one angle. And from the other angle, it's a real estate developer that does energy. If you're building one of these, let's say a wind farm, you might need anywhere between 20 to 50,000 contiguous acres of land. To do that, to stitch together that footprint, especially because everyone you approach within a given area is not going to either be willing or able to participate. So you're going to have these gaps. You really need to be in these rural communities. You need to be in these places where people have large, unobstructed plots of land connected to one another. And that effort of identifying the land and negotiating the land, stitching it all together, and then de-risking the land, right, to make sure that we actually can build here. There's not easements that we can't get around, or railroads, or subsurface conditions that wouldn't support the facility, those types of things. That's a full-time job for dozens of people per project.
Right. Tell me a little bit about what is it like to go into those rural communities and to work with them with something so passionate, often for all of us, which is the land we live on.
The thing you have to lead with is respect, right? You have to lead with respect and you have to lead with understanding. And I think when you do that, you're able to get to the solution a lot easier. So, for example, in a lot of these communities, a lot of these agrarian communities, the land that people have, some of that land was passed down from their parents and maybe from their parents. And many of the folks who are farming this land are thinking in their head, I'm going to pass this down to my children, my grandchildren. So this is going to stay in the family for hundreds of years. And so if you approach someone with that mindset and say, for a project that, let's say, is going to last from the start of the execution of the agreement to decommissioning of the facility, let's say it's going to last 50 years, max 30 to 50 years. When you approach them and say, I want to buy this, the answer is no. Or the value they assign to it is astronomical, because they're thinking 200 years into the future and you're thinking 50. And if you're talking about a lot of these facilities, there's also the opportunity to coexist with the existing agricultural use while only taking certain portions of the surface out of use temporarily for the facilities. And so once you realize that, okay, well, we can get a lease or an easement, or a lease and easement right on this land and coexist with them, now you can have the conversation, right? Now you're not just thinking, oh, I need to aggregate this land, so I'm going to go buy it. That's the simplest way to do it. Now you realize, okay, I can talk to these folks because they've got utility easements, they've got oil and gas easements on their land. I can approach them the way that they've already been approached in the past, and I can lay out what's basically a partnership, a long-term partnership with them and their neighbors.
He says the partnership is financially beneficial and ideally beneficial to the local infrastructure too.
We constantly hear about put upon farmers and how certain elements of global trade are depressing the prices of certain crops, or are forcing people to only focus on certain crops. And this is another way that there's an injection of capital into those communities based on the fact that a lot of these folks are landowners and their largest asset is their land. There are times when, we've had discussions around projects where we needed a water supply, a municipal water supply, and the municipal water system was in shambles. And so we upgraded the entire water system to something that would serve a metropolis instead of this rural area, so that it could appropriately serve us. But we also upgraded other parts of it so that now it's going to appropriately serve the communities and be better for everyone. And so the injection of resource and infrastructure upgrade and just pure capital into these communities can sometimes just be monumental.
Tyrone, so you've done some pretty significant deals and development work in the Midwest, Oklahoma, North Texas. Do you typically get to go to those parts of the country to see these projects in person? Is that interesting for a 16-year-old kid from Philadelphia to walk into these rural parts of the United States and talk with them about, sustainable energy?
Yes and no. My role is not to sell the project to local stakeholders or to individual landowners. And so I don't have to be in any of these communities. I get to go. And I do like going to see the result, right, of so much work, of so many stakeholders at Invenergy. So I get to go, and on occasion I do, and I've seen some of the facilities where it's bare land. I've seen some where they're finishing construction. I've seen some where they're in operation, and it's all exciting, and it's all great to be able to reduce all of the paper pushing that's happening in the phone calls to something very physical and very tangible. There are times when you want to be careful, and depending where you go. And the reality is that there are places in this country many places in this country where someone who looks like me is not always made to feel welcome. Vast majority of the communities we work with, I would say all the communities we work with, the vast majority of people in those communities are just good, honest people. But in rural areas and in urban areas, there are people who are not. And as someone who grew up in the city, I probably falsely, when you look at some of the numbers in places like Chicago, feel more secure in a crowded area where all of my services are within an arm's reach, or within a shot of a good golf ball. And so I take that into account. Like the idea of me being by myself driving a rental car on a back dark road in the middle of nowhere is not something I'm typically signing up for. With that in mind, I have gone to places where I think it makes the most sense and visited and met, in each occasion, some of the most amazing people.
And when Tyrone does travel to rural areas to assess the landscape, he is looking at a lot of land. These wind farm transactions are huge, and I asked him to put them in context. So
we talk a lot in parcels because for your home, typically it's one parcel, right? One tax pin. For a lot of these farm holdings, It's multiple parcels because they've aggregated over time together their holdings, and for a variety of reasons have not merged them into a single tax parcel. And so, at the end of the year and into the new year, this was public. Invenergy closed financing and started construction on the largest single phase wind farm in the country's history, and the largest single wind farm financing in the country's history, north of $1 billion. When you look at that, for those who have looked at title and commercial real estate, you're talking at 1,000 parcels, you're talking maybe 20, 30,000 potential issues that have to be vetted and reviewed and acknowledged. And maybe then documents have to be drafted if there's an issue that needs to be cured. Conversations have to happen about each of those individual ones internally or with our outside resources. And so it's just a mammoth undertaking that takes, swarms of people, years to work through, just in a slow, methodical process.
And then wind has its own idiosyncrasies. Tyrone says the turbines can't be placed too close together.
Let's say if one turbine is downwind from another, the turbine that's upwind is effectively reducing the wind that's reaching the downwind turbine. And so that turbine can't generate its full capacity. So they have to be spaced out significantly to allow for that. And that also with wind farms, there's a lot of space that you have to engineer and design in between the turbines. And then each of the turbines is collecting the energy and bringing that back to a transformer. And then obviously there are roads from the public roads to get to each turbine because they're maintained. And in typical fashion, they're climbed every single day just to check.
You brought this up a little bit, and I'd like to dig into it a little bit, but you've been a big advocate for people of color in the law. And I'm just curious what spurred your work in that area. Tell us a little bit about that.
So there are a lot of people who could and should be better advocates for people of color in the law. And as a young attorney, I experienced that firsthand. And it's not only attorneys of color who are leaning into helping attorneys of color in the law or looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives, but I would say there's a critical mass of attorneys of color who I think have personal experiences and are doing what I'm doing, which is trying to help people not have the same experiences. And so, I was in law school and people would say, you just reach out to people and set up for these informational interviews. And that's how you get to know what's going on. And I would reach out to the places that my colleagues, my friends would reach out to, friends who were not of color, and comparable grades, everything else. And I would not get the replies. My name's Tyrone. You know roughly what my color is when you see it on paper. And I noticed that. And I noticed the people that would take the information were by and large people of color, people that would sit down with me and have coffee with me. And so, at a fundamental level, I always take the coffee. I always take the call. I'm always willing to talk to someone who's putting a law student or a junior lawyer in touch with me just to chat or get an idea, especially lawyers and law students of color. Because I know that for a variety of reasons we don't really need to unpack, they're not getting the same level of attention that their colleagues are.
Any advice that you would give to those individuals kind of coming up? So maybe someone from your hometown or anywhere, really. Well,
first, you can feel free to reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn. I might not get back to you immediately. I am somewhat busy, but I'll get back to you or get you in touch with somebody else. The other thing I would say is still do the thing that I did. Like, don't shoot yourself in the foot. Try, apply, reach out, ask the question. You never know. 1, 2, rejection is a great character builder for future success. And then 3, you don't get to whine about opportunities that didn't pan out for you if you didn't try for them. And there's a lot of people trying to make the world better than it was in their day. And a lot of people who tried to do the same thing for me. And hopefully at some point the world will be a little better and you will be able to take advantage of these opportunities if you try and you lean into them. The other thing I would say is look out. There are groups. There are tons of people whose reaction to the same circumstances I described is to create organizations focused on minority professionals and helping sort of circle the wagon and advance them in the way that the broader business community has not. We all have informal networks that we tap all the time when opportunities come up. And so I would say find those organizations, get involved with them. You're going to be able to see certain opportunities, and you're also going to be able to hear people who can commiserate with you. If you're a lawyer and you're African American, you very well might be in a circumstance where you're the only person. But we can all share stories, about being the only person, and it'll make you feel a little less lonely in that journey.
Career guidance isn't the only way Tyrone gives back. Food insecurity is also on his mind. He's on the board of his local food bank, and early in the pandemic, he founded his own nonprofit, Conversation for Six. That name comes from the food writer MFK Fisher, who once said, 6 people made the perfect number for a casual dinner. Tyrone says not always knowing where your next meal is coming from, it's personal to him.
I grew up in a family that was just on the right side of the food insecure line. And there are a lot of people I grew up with who were on the wrong side. And my grandfather was a Baptist minister. We went to his church growing up, which was within our community. And you would do these big dinners on Sundays, and a bunch of people would donate the food, and you would sort of cook these dinners with these big sort of aluminum serving trays, and people would eat, but you see people take multiple plates, styrofoam plates covered in aluminum foil, and they weren't taking them to people who weren't there. They were taking them home to eat them for the later days, and everyone knew that, which is why, I grew up in a household where in a culture where it was a bad sign if you had people over and there weren't leftovers. Like, there should always be more than enough food if you could do it for folks. And so it was personal, and it was something that I saw, you saw firsthand. And, went to elementary school with kids who didn't have enough to eat. And so for me, it's been something to stay close to, because it affected the community I grew up in, but I think it affects so many other people. And I think that what we ask of a lot of people is really difficult if we can't cover off, food and safety. At a base level, I think it's very hard to get people to focus on, a ton of higher order elements that are necessary for community building and for upward mobility if you're not covering the basics.
Tyrone, I love what you've done, and I sincerely appreciate your time.
I appreciate you all having me. So, feeling is mutual.
Thanks for listening to the first episode of Built. We hope you enjoyed it. If you have feedback, we'd like to hear it. Shoot us an email at built@fnf.com. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode. Built is a co-production of Fidelity National Financial and PRX Productions. From FNF, our project is run by Annie Barteles. At PRX, our team is producer Ashley Milntite, production manager Genevieve Sponsler, production assistant Courtney Florentine, and intern Claire Carlander. Audio mastering by Rebecca Seidel. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. Special thanks for help with this episode goes to Fred Glassman and Joanna Patelis. I'm Brian Mon. Every story is unique, every property is individual, but we're all part of this built world.